I was standing in the dark of a bridal dressing room when I heard my husband laugh about replacing me. Not divorcing me, not separating. Replacing me. The words drifted through the thin wall like smoke. After tomorrow night, everything transfers. She won't even understand what she's signing. Another voice, clinical, answered, the cognitive review will justify it. Once the paperwork is executed, control shifts immediately. Then my husband again. 30 years of marriage in that voice. 30 years of shared mortgages, funerals, graduations, quiet Sunday mornings. She won't see it coming, he said softly. She trusts me. And in that small, dark space with the smell of perfume and pressed satin around me, I realized something I had never considered in 3 decades of loving him. Trust can be weaponized. The anniversary party was supposed to be simple. 30 years of marriage, 200 guests, our children flying in from opposite coasts, a string quartet in the backyard, champagne from Napa, speeches about endurance, loyalty, and building something that lasts. I drove to Callaway's boutique that afternoon to pick up James's suit, a charcoal 3-piece he had chosen with the careful pride of a man who still cared how his wife looked at him. The sun was warm. I remember thinking how lucky I was that we had made it this far. Callaway's had been in town for 40 years. Margaret, the owner, had tailored James's suit herself. When I stepped inside, the place was quiet except for the low hum of overhead lights and the faint scent of steamed fabric. Victoria, Margaret said, her voice thinner than usual. You're early. I figured I'd surprise him, make sure everything's perfect. She didn't smile. Instead, she walked around the counter, took my elbow, not roughly but firmly, and said in a whisper, "Come with me right now." I laughed, thinking maybe James was here and Margaret wanted to stage some sort of playful reveal. But Margaret didn't laugh. She led me past the racks of silk and linen and pushed open the door to a dressing room. "Stay here," she whispered. "Don't say a word." "Margaret, what is this about?" She shook her head, already stepping away. "You need to hear this yourself." The door closed. The light clicked off. I stood there surrounded by mirrors and fabric, feeling foolish and slightly annoyed. Then I heard the bell over the shop door. James's voice followed. Clear, familiar, warm. "Is it ready?" he asked. "Yes," Margaret replied, too brightly. Back by the fitting area. Footsteps approached. Another set followed. A woman's voice, one I recognized vaguely from a recent dinner. Dr. Sandra Klein, a neurologist James had insisted I see after what he called that little episode 6 months ago. It had been nothing more than a brief dizzy spell at a board meeting. Stress, the ER doctor had said. Dehydration. But James had pressed for follow-ups, memory tests, evaluations. "You understand," Dr. Klein said now, her tone businesslike, "that once the cognitive review is filed, we can move forward legally." My heart began to pound. James exhaled slowly. "I know. I just need it done cleanly." "And the power of attorney amendment?" she asked. "It's drafted. She'll sign it tomorrow night. I'll tell her it's just contingency planning after the party when she's relaxed." A third voice joined them, younger, smooth. "I've already prepared the transfer documents," he said. "Once control shifts, we can restructure the assets before she realizes what's happening." I knew that voice. Nathan Graves, financial consultant, 12 years younger than me, introduced to us last year as someone who could modernize Hayes Interiors. James's laugh drifted through the wall. "She won't realize. She still thinks this is about simplifying things." "And the assisted living placement?" Nathan asked. There was a pause. My lungs felt tight. "We won't need it immediately," James said carefully. "But once the evaluation labels her impaired, it'll be easier. Gradual, respectable. The children will understand if the doctors recommend it." The room seemed to tilt. Impaired. Assisted living. Control shifts. 30 years of marriage echoed in my ears. I'm not doing this to hurt her, James said quietly. She's been slipping. She forgets things. She zones out. The board has noticed. That's why this needs to be swift, Dr. Klein replied. For everyone's protection. For everyone's protection. I pressed my back against the wall of that dressing room and felt something inside me fracture. Yes, I had mislaid my reading glasses twice last month. Yes, I had reread a paragraph in a proposal because my mind drifted. But I still ran a company with 180 employees. I still negotiated contracts. I still remembered the day James walked toward me at the altar in a rented tuxedo that was slightly too short in the sleeves. She won't see it coming. His words came back to me like a slap. And then the final blow. Nathan's voice lowered. After tomorrow, you won't have to pretend anymore. James didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. I'm tired of pretending, he said. Footsteps moved, fabric rustled. I just want peace, he added. Peace through replacement. Through erasure. They spoke for another few minutes about timelines, about signatures, about how best to frame things to our children. I stood there in darkness, my reflection multiplied infinitely in the mirror behind me, each reflection asking the same question. How long? How long had this been unfolding while I believed we were planning a celebration? The bell over the shop door rang again as they left. Silence returned. A moment later, the dressing room door opened and light flooded in. Margaret stood there, eyes wet. I'm sorry, she whispered. I stepped out slowly, my legs unsteady. How long have you known? I asked. She swallowed. I overheard them last week. They've been coming in together. I didn't want to believe it. Neither did I. I looked at the garment bag hanging on the rack. James's anniversary suit. Perfectly pressed. Ready for a celebration. Did he say anything about me? I asked. Margaret hesitated. He said, she trusts me. I let out a breath that felt like it came from somewhere deep in my chest. 30 years, 2 children, a shared life built from nothing. And tomorrow night, in front of everyone we loved, he intended to quietly take control of everything I had worked for, and possibly my autonomy along with it. I picked up the garment bag. Thank you, I said to Margaret, though I wasn't sure what I was thanking her for. As I walked out into the late afternoon sun, the world looked exactly the same. Cars passed. People laughed on the sidewalk. Somewhere someone was mowing a lawn. But inside me, something fundamental had shifted. Tomorrow night wasn't going to be an anniversary. It was going to be an execution. And if James wanted a performance, I would give him one. I drove home with James's suit hanging in the back seat like evidence. The late afternoon light filtered through the windshield, warm and deceptively gentle. For a few miles, I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. Then something colder settled inside me. Not panic, not rage. Calculation. If I walked through the front door and confronted him, he would deny everything. Dr. Klein would produce clinical language. Nathan would frame it as prudent planning, and I would become the unstable one. No. I had heard enough to know this would require patience. By the time I turned into our driveway, I had arranged my face into something neutral, almost tired, nothing more. The house sat where it had always sat, overlooking the river we had chosen together 30 years ago when we were young enough to believe we would live forever. James loved that view, said the water made him feel calm. When I stepped inside, I could hear music from the kitchen. Miles Davis, James's favorite. He was standing at the island reviewing a stack of place cards for the anniversary dinner. You're back early, he said, smiling without looking up. I wanted to make sure the suit was ready. He turned then, brushing a strand of silver-streaked hair from his forehead. He had aged beautifully, gracefully, the kind of man who still commanded attention in a room without raising his voice. Is it perfect? He asked. It's perfect. I watched him closely for some flicker of guilt, some hesitation. There was none. He crossed the room and kissed my cheek. His lips were warm. Familiar. We made it, Victoria, he said softly. 30 years. 30 years. I know, I replied. He returned to the place cards. I added Dr. Klein to the guest list. She's done so much for us this year. Of course she had. That's thoughtful, I said evenly. He studied me then, tilting his head slightly. Are you feeling okay? The question would have once felt caring. Now it sounded diagnostic. I'm fine, I said. You seemed distracted this morning. Just thinking about tomorrow. He nodded, satisfied. I went upstairs to my office and closed the door. 30 years of trust. The words echoed in my mind. We had met in Boston in 1993. I was 29, working 2 jobs while trying to build an interior design firm out of a converted garage. He was working in finance for a regional investment house. We met at a mutual friend's dinner party. He laughed at something I said about wallpaper trends, and I remember thinking I had never wanted to impress someone so badly. We married 2 years later in a small chapel. No orchestra, no catered affair, just wooden pews and wildflowers from the garden. We built Hayes Interiors together. I handled creative direction. He managed the business side. We survived the recession. We refinanced our townhouse when the market collapsed. We put both our children through college without loans. When our son broke his collarbone at age 10, James slept in a hospital chair for 2 nights straight. When my mother died, he held me while I cried in the kitchen like a child. There had been fights, of course. Money, parenting, my long hours, his frustration with my independence. But betrayal had never entered the equation. 6 months ago, during a quarterly board presentation, I had paused mid-sentence while reviewing projections. The numbers blurred for a moment. My head felt light. I finished the meeting. Later that evening, I told James I'd felt dizzy. He insisted on taking me to the ER. The doctors found nothing alarming. Stress, they said. But James pressed. He scheduled an appointment with Dr. Sandra Klein. She's one of the best neurologists in the state, he had said. It's just precaution. Precaution turned into cognitive assessments, memory recall tests, brain scans. You forgot where you put your phone last week, he'd reminded me gently. You called our neighbor by the wrong name. I had laughed it off. Now, replaying it, the pattern looked different. The narrative had been forming quietly. Victoria is slipping. Victoria needs oversight. Victoria should consider transitioning responsibilities. I opened my laptop and began reviewing the last 6 months of company records. Nathan Graves had been introduced 9 months ago at a charity gala. 36, polished, Ivy League. He specialized in legacy planning and asset restructuring for aging founders. He had flattered me. You've built something remarkable, Mrs. Hayes. It deserves to outlive you. Outlive me. He had gradually inserted himself into financial discussions, proposed offshore holding structures for tax efficiency, recommended updates to the trust. James had supported every suggestion. You don't want to burden the kids, he had said. Simplify things. My cursor hovered over the trust amendment draft Nathan had emailed last month. At the time, I had skimmed it. Now I read every line. Buried in the language was a clause allowing temporary transfer of operational control in the event of documented cognitive impairment. And who would document that impairment? Dr. Klein. My stomach tightened. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. James stepped into the office without waiting for permission. You've been in here a while, he said lightly. Everything okay? I turned slowly in my chair. Just going over some numbers. He walked behind me and placed his hands on my shoulders. You don't have to carry everything alone anymore, he said. You've done enough. The tone was soothing, reassuring, and suddenly suffocating. I'm not finished yet, I replied, forcing a smile. He laughed, but it was a half-second too delayed. Of course you're not, he said. Don't be dramatic. Dramatic. Was I, or was I finally seeing clearly? He squeezed my shoulders once more before leaving the room. When the door clicked shut, I exhaled slowly. I replayed the boutique conversation in my mind. After tomorrow night, everything transfers. She won't even understand what she's signing. The assisted living placement. A life gently managed into a corner. Not through violence. Through paperwork. Through concern. Through love. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a small leather notebook I hadn't used in years. On the first page, I wrote, "What do they think I don't see?" Underneath that, I listed names. Sandra Klein. Nathan Graves. Trust amendment. Cognitive review. Offshore restructuring. Then I wrote something else. Find proof. Because instinct wasn't enough. Emotion wasn't enough. If I wanted to survive what was coming, I needed evidence. 30 years of trust had built my life. But tomorrow night, that trust would be tested. And if James believed I was fading, he was about to discover how wrong he was. The morning after the boutique, I did something I never imagined I would do in my own marriage. I hired someone to follow my husband. The decision came without drama. No pacing, no wine at dawn. Just clarity. If James was building a case to erase me, I would build one to protect myself. I drove 2 towns over to an office park that looked like every other office park in America. Low brick buildings, trimmed hedges, a flagpole that creaked in the wind. The name on the directory read Susan Farrell, Investigative Services. Susan had spent 19 years with the state attorney general's office before opening her own firm. We'd met once at a civic fundraiser. She had struck me as the kind of woman who noticed inconsistencies before sitting down. When I stepped into her office, she stood to shake my hand. Late 50s, sharp eyes, a calm that felt earned rather than practiced. "Mrs. Hayes," she said. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't expect to be here," I replied. She waited. "I need discretion," I said. "And speed." She closed the blinds before I finished the next sentence. I told her everything. The dressing room, the voices, the words cognitive review, power of attorney, assisted living. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she leaned back slowly. "Do you have proof?" she asked. "Not yet." "Then we gather it." She explained the process calmly, methodically. Phone metadata, financial tracing, surveillance, background checks. "People planning something this structured leave trails," she said. "They always think they're cleaner than they are. Can you move quickly?" "How quickly do you need?" "The anniversary party is tomorrow night." Her eyebrow lifted slightly. "Then we start now." By afternoon, Susan had 2 associates assigned. One focused on James's communications. The other began reviewing corporate filings tied to Nathan Graves. I returned home and behaved exactly as I had for 30 years. I asked about the caterer. I tasted the wine. I confirmed the seating chart. But inside, something sharp had replaced the easy rhythm of married life. That evening, James suggested we review a few documents before tomorrow gets hectic. We sat at the kitchen island under the warm glow of pendant lights. He slid a thin folder toward me. "It's just housekeeping," he said. "Nathan thinks we should streamline authority structures in case something ever happens." I opened it slowly. Power of attorney amendment. Transfer of operational authority. Contingent cognitive certification. The language was dense, but the outcome was simple. If Dr. Klein documented cognitive impairment, even temporary, James would gain immediate control of all company operations and discretionary financial authority. My name would remain on paper. My influence would not. "You've been under so much stress," he continued gently. "This protects you." "Protects." "That's thoughtful," I said evenly. I know it's hard for you to talk about aging, he added. But we have to be realistic. I signed nothing. I'd like to have my attorney glance at this, I said. A flicker crossed his face. Small, quick. Of course, he replied too quickly. I just thought it would be easier before the party. Easier for whom? That night I lay beside him in bed, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. 30 years of shared sleep, and I had never felt more alone. By noon the next day, Susan called. I have something, she said. I stepped outside to take the call. Nathan Graves formed an LLC 3 months ago, Susan continued. Blue Crescent Holdings. That means nothing by itself. It does when your trust amendment references Blue Crescent as a restructuring vehicle. Silence stretched between us. Who's listed as managing partner? I asked. James Hayes and Nathan Graves. The river shimmered in front of me. Children rode bikes on the sidewalk across the street. Normal life continued. What else? Dr. Klein received a consulting fee from Blue Crescent 2 weeks ago. $50,000. The air left my lungs slowly. Consulting for what? Susan paused. Medical documentation services. There it was. The price of my impairment. I need everything in writing, I said. You'll have it. And Susan? Dig deeper into Graves. She was quiet for a moment. I already am. By 4 o'clock, Susan emailed a preliminary report. Nathan Graves had previously worked for a financial advisory firm investigated for securities irregularities. No charges had stuck, but the pattern was there. Aggressive asset reallocation, offshore movement, client opacity. Blue Crescent had an account in the Cayman Islands. 2 authorized signatories. James Hayes. Nathan Graves. I printed the documents and locked them in my desk. Then I went downstairs to help arrange flowers. Guests would begin arriving in less than 24 hours. James stood in the living room directing a rental crew. He looked composed, confident, calm. I studied him from across the room. Was this fear, greed, desperation, or something else entirely? He caught me watching. What? He asked lightly. Just thinking how lucky I am, I replied. He smiled. If you keep saying that, people will think you've gone sentimental in your old age. Old age. I smiled back. If he believed I was fading, he was about to witness the most focused version of me he had ever known. That evening, Susan sent a final update before the party. We have documentation of planned asset transfers scheduled for 9:32 p.m. tomorrow night, she said over the phone. That's during the toast, I replied quietly. Yes. Electronic authorization. You would only need to sign the trust amendment physically. The rest triggers automatically. Once I'm declared impaired. Yes. And if I refuse? Then they'll attempt to frame refusal as proof of instability. The elegance of it was almost impressive. You'll be there tomorrow? I asked. In the crowd, Susan said. With everything. I hung up and stood alone in my office. On the desk lay 30 years of photographs. Our wedding day, the birth of our children, family vacations, company holiday parties. Had he been planning this for months? Or had it grown slowly from fear? Fear of losing control, fear of watching me age, fear of vulnerability? I didn't know. But I knew one thing with certainty. Tomorrow night would not end the way he expected. If he intended to quietly erase me, I would force the truth into the light. The morning of the anniversary party arrived bright and deceptively peaceful. Sunlight spilled across the river, turning the water into fractured glass. The house smelled of fresh-cut peonies and catered hors d'oeuvres warming in stainless steel trays. From the outside, nothing suggested collapse. Inside, I had never felt more alert. James was already dressed in his robe when I came downstairs. His hair was combed back loosely. He looked relaxed, steady, the the picture of a man celebrating a milestone. "You're up early," he said, glancing at me through the hallway mirror. "Couldn't sleep," I replied. "Nerves?" "Maybe." He smiled. "It's just a party, Victoria. Just a party." I poured coffee and watched him move through the kitchen with the effortless ease he had always carried. For 30 years, I had admired that steadiness. I had relied on it. Now I studied it. At 9:15 a.m., my phone buzzed. A single message from Susan. All documentation secured. Electronic transfer scheduled 9:32 p.m. Dr. Klein confirmed attendance. Graves arrived in town last night. I deleted the message immediately. "Is everything under control?" James asked casually. "Always," I said. By early afternoon, the backyard had transformed. White linen tables stretched across the lawn. Lanterns hung from the elm trees. A stage had been assembled near the water for speeches. Staff moved efficiently between the house and the bar tent. Our daughter Sophie arrived first. She stepped out of her rental car and ran toward James with open arms. 30 years, she laughed. "You two are indestructible." Indestructible. I hugged her tightly. She smelled like the same vanilla shampoo she'd used in college. "You look tired, Mom," she said quietly when James turned away. "Big week. You sure you're okay?" I met her eyes. "I'm fine." I would not drag our children into suspicion without proof. Not yet. By 4 o'clock, guests began arriving in waves. Colleagues from Hayes Interiors, old neighbors, friends from the neighborhood, investors. Each handshake felt surreal. 30 years, Victoria. That's rare these days. You've built something remarkable. Your marriage is an example. Example. James moved through the crowd like a seasoned host. His laughter rang out naturally. If guilt existed, it wore no visible mask. At 6 p.m., Dr. Sandra Klein arrived. She approached with measured warmth. "Victoria," she said, gripping my hand firmly. "You look wonderful." "Feeling stronger every day," I replied evenly. She held my gaze a moment too long. "Good," she said. "That's good." Nathan Graves followed shortly after. Charcoal suit, polished smile, perfectly composed. "Mrs. Hayes," he said smoothly. "What a milestone." "Indeed," I replied. His eyes flicked briefly toward James across the lawn. A look passed between them. Subtle, efficient. Susan stood near the bar tent, blending into a group of guests discussing property values. She gave no signal. None was needed. Everything was in place. As twilight settled, the string quartet began playing softly. Candles flickered across the lawn. The mood shifted into something warm and reflective. Dinner concluded around 8:45 p.m. At 9 o'clock, James squeezed my hand. "Time for your speech," he whispered. My speech. I stood slowly and stepped onto the small stage near the river. The microphone hummed faintly as I adjusted it. 200 faces turned toward me. For a moment, I saw nothing but decades. Birthdays, business launches, vacations, arguments resolved in quiet kitchens. I cleared my throat. 30 years ago, I began. James and I stood in a small chapel with wooden pews and wildflowers. Light laughter rippled through the crowd. We had no idea what we were building. A company, a family, a life. I glanced at James. He smiled, eyes shining. For 30 years, I believed in one thing above all else. I paused deliberately. Trust. The word hung in the air. Trust is what allows two people to build something larger than themselves. It's what allows a business to grow, a family to thrive. Guests nodded. I continued calmly. But trust requires clarity. James's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. And tonight, before we raise our glasses, there are a few documents I'd like to clarify. A murmur moved through the crowd. I stepped down from the stage and gestured toward the large screen that had been set up for a slideshow of family photos. Susan stepped forward. The screen flickered to life. Instead of anniversary pictures, a scanned document appeared. Blue Crescent Holdings, Articles of Formation. A few guests leaned forward. 3 months ago, I said evenly, my husband and our financial advisor formed a new holding company. Blue Crescent. Nathan shifted subtly in his seat. James's hand tightened around his champagne glass. This company was structured to receive control of Hayes Interiors upon the documentation of my cognitive impairment. Gasps spread across the lawn. James stood abruptly. Victoria, this is inappropriate. I raised a hand gently. Let me finish. Another document appeared. Consulting fee, Dr. Sandra Klein, $50,000. The crowd went silent. A payment, I continued, for medical documentation services. Dr. Klein's face drained of color. You're misrepresenting, she began. I am presenting records, I replied calmly. The next slide displayed email correspondence between Nathan and James discussing the timing of the electronic transfer scheduled for 9:32 p.m. The timestamp glowed on the screen. 9:32 p.m. It was 9:27. I looked at James directly. Would you like to explain why control of my company is set to transfer in 5 minutes? His lips parted, but no words came. Nathan stepped forward. This is standard estate planning, he said sharply. You're confused. Am I? I asked quietly. The final slide appeared. The assisted living pre-admission form. My name typed neatly at the top. Silence swallowed the lawn. Sophie covered her mouth. Our son Owen stood frozen beside the elm tree. James's voice broke. You were forgetting things, he said desperately. You scared me. Scared you enough to erase me? I asked. The clock on the screen turned 9:31. I pulled a folded document from my jacket. This, I said, holding it up, is a temporary injunction filed this afternoon. The transfer is frozen. 9:32 p.m. Nothing happened. Nathan glanced at his phone. His composure fractured. Dr. Klein stepped backward. James looked at me, not with anger but with something closer to shock. You hired someone, he whispered. Yes, I said. For the first time all evening, my voice trembled. Not with weakness, but with the weight of 30 years collapsing at once. You told them I wouldn't see it coming. I let the silence stretch. But I did. The string quartet had stopped playing. The river behind us lay perfectly still. I won't sign anything tonight, I said quietly. And I won't be placed anywhere against my will. I turned back toward the crowd. I'm sorry you had to witness this, but clarity matters. Then I stepped down from the stage. James stood motionless in his charcoal suit, surrounded by 200 stunned guests. 30 years of image shattered in under 10 minutes. And for the first time in months, I felt completely awake. For a few seconds after I stepped down from the stage, no one moved. The only sound was the soft lapping of water against the dock. Then the murmurs began. Low at first, disbelieving. Chairs scraped against stone. Glasses clinked as people shifted. James stood perfectly still beneath the lantern light. His anniversary suit shimmered faintly in the breeze. And for a strange, disorienting moment, he looked exactly like the man I had married. Composed, elegant, unshakable. But his eyes were different. Not soft, not steady. Calculating. Victoria, he said carefully, his voice controlled. You've misunderstood what this was. Have I? I asked quietly. Nathan stepped forward first. He recovered faster than James did. This is a private family matter, he announced to the crowd. There's no reason to escalate it in front of everyone. Escalate? I repeated calmly. You scheduled an asset transfer for 9:32 p.m. A few guests checked their watches instinctively. Nathan's jaw tightened. You're proving our concerns right now. The tactic was almost admirable. Reframe me as unstable, impulsive, paranoid. Dr. Klein cleared her throat and approached with practiced sympathy. Victoria, cognitive stress can distort perception, she began gently. We only recommended precautionary planning. Did you recommend a pre-admission assisted living agreement as well? I asked. Gasps rippled again through the guests. Dr. Klein's composure cracked. That document was exploratory. It was signed, I said. By you. Silence again. Sophie stepped toward her father. Dad, is this true? She asked, voice trembling. James's gaze flicked toward his daughter. I was trying to protect her, he said. You've all seen it. The forgetfulness, the distraction. Owen stepped forward now. Mom still runs the company, he said sharply. She closed a $9 million contract last month. Nathan interjected quickly. High-functioning impairment is common. Enough, I said firmly. I walked back toward the stage and picked up the microphone again, not because I needed amplification, but because it forced stillness. I am not impaired, I said evenly. But even if I were, that decision would not belong to a secret LLC. My eyes moved across the crowd slowly. I built Hayes Interiors from a converted garage in our first home. James was beside me every step of the way. I paused. That's why this hurts. The vulnerability in my voice shifted the atmosphere. This wasn't rage. It wasn't spectacle. It was betrayal laid bare. James's shoulders sagged slightly. You were slipping, he insisted quietly. You forgot Sophie's birthday dinner. I mixed up the date by one day, I replied. You left the stove on. For 3 minutes. You scared me, he said, louder now. You scared me because I watched my mother vanish into dementia. I watched my father lose everything because she refused to plan. The crowd shifted again. There it was. Fear, raw and unfiltered. For a moment, the anger inside me faltered. I would have planned with you, I said softly. You didn't need to ambush me. Nathan stepped in once more, voice sharper now. Let's be practical. Even if you stop tonight's transfer, this doesn't go away. The board has concerns. I smiled faintly. I met with the board this afternoon. His expression changed. I presented them with documentation of Blue Crescent and your Cayman accounts. A ripple of whispers spread through the investors in attendance. You had no right, Nathan began. I had every right, I replied calmly. It's my company. They voted unanimously to suspend any restructuring tied to your firm. Effective immediately. His confidence finally cracked. Dr. Klein attempted one last recovery. This is emotionally charged. Perhaps we should reconvene privately. We will, I said. With attorneys. James looked at me then, not as an adversary, not as a co-conspirator, but as someone who had miscalculated. I never meant to humiliate you. He whispered. You humiliated me the moment you said I wouldn't see it coming. His eyes glistened. For a fraction of a second, I saw the young man from that chapel in 1993, the one who believed in partnership, in struggle, in building something together. And then I remembered the dressing room. After tomorrow night, everything transfers. I lowered the microphone. I'm not pressing charges tonight, I said quietly. But this ends now. I turned towards Susan, who nodded once from the edge of the crowd. Copies of all documentation have been filed with legal counsel, I added. Any further attempt to declare me impaired without independent evaluation will be considered fraud. The word landed heavily. Fraud. James closed his eyes. Guests began quietly gathering their things. The anniversary cake sat untouched on its silver stand. 30 years represented in white frosting and gold ribbon. Sophie approached me slowly. "Mom," she said, voice shaking. "Why didn't you tell us?" "I needed proof," I answered. Owen stood beside her, jaw tight. "You're not going anywhere," he said firmly. "No," I replied. Across the lawn, Nathan was already on his phone, pacing. Dr. Klein slipped away quietly. James remained where he stood. The lanterns flickered above him, casting shifting shadows across his face. I walked toward him slowly. We stood close enough to feel each other's breath. "Why didn't you talk to me?" I asked. His voice was small now. "Because you would have said no." "Yes," I said. And I was afraid of what that meant. Of losing control. There it was again. Control. Not love. Not safety. Control. The string quartet members packed their instruments silently. Caterers cleared plates. The river reflected the moon in fractured pieces. "I won't sign anything," I said gently. "And I won't disappear quietly." He nodded faintly. "I know," he whispered. I stepped back. "I loved you enough to trust you," I added. "You should have loved me enough to speak to me." The distance between us felt wider than the river. 30 years ended not with shouting, but with understanding. And sometimes that's worse. The guests left in fragments. Clusters of whispered conversations drifted toward the driveway. Car doors shut softly as if the night itself required gentleness. No one raised their voice. No one lingered for cake. The lawn that had been dressed for celebration now looked like the aftermath of a quiet storm. Lanterns still swayed above empty chairs. The anniversary banner fluttered against the elm tree reading, 30 Years of Love, in gold script that felt almost ironic now. I stood near the water long after most of the guests had gone. Behind me, I could hear James speaking in low tones to Sophie. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to see it to know that our children were asking questions that would not have easy answers. Susan approached quietly. "Transfer blocked," she said under her breath. "Bank confirmed the freeze." "Good. Your legal counsel has the documentation. If they attempt anything further, you're covered." "Thank you." She studied me carefully. "You're holding up better than most would." "I don't feel better," I said. She nodded once. "That's normal." Normal. Nothing about the last 24 hours felt normal. When the last rental van pulled away and the staff finished clearing tables, the house felt cavernous. Sophie and Owen remained. We gathered in the kitchen, the same room where James and I had once debated renovation plans in school districts and business loans. Now it was a tribunal. "Dad," Sophie said carefully. "Did you really plan to move Mom into assisted living?" James sat at the island, still in his anniversary suit, expression hollowed. "I was trying to protect her," he said again, but the conviction had drained from his voice. "From what?" Owen asked sharply. "From herself?" James turned toward him. "You didn't see what I saw. The forgetfulness, the distraction." "I saw stress," I said quietly. He looked at me then, not defensive, just tired. "You didn't watch your grandmother fade away," he said softly. "You didn't sit beside her when she forgot your name." There it was again. Fear masquerading as foresight. "And so you decided to skip the conversation entirely?" I asked. "If I asked you, you would have refused." "Because I am not impaired." He inhaled sharply. "Maybe not yet." The words landed harder than anything else he'd said that night. Owen shook his head in disbelief. "This isn't about medical fear," he said. "It's about control." Silence followed. James didn't deny it. Sophie's voice trembled. "Dad, were you and Nathan?" "No," James said quickly. Too quickly. Susan had warned me about that reaction. "There's documentation of financial entanglement," I said calmly. "And consulting fees." His jaw tightened. "Nathan offered solutions, he replied. You were resistant to change. You wouldn't modernize the company. So you modernized me instead. Sophie covered her mouth again. The cruelty of it was not in violence. It was in process. Paperwork, clauses, gradual displacement. I never meant to hurt you, James whispered. But you did. Owen stepped forward, voice firm. Mom's getting a full independent evaluation, he said. From someone not on Blue Crescent's payroll. I agree, I replied immediately. James flinched slightly. I'm not afraid of transparency, I added. Are you? His silence answered. The next morning, the house felt hollow. Sophie and Owen had left before sunrise, both promising to return within the week. James and I sat at opposite ends of the breakfast table. No music played. No place cards waited to be arranged. Where do we go from here? He asked finally. Attorneys, I said. His eyes closed briefly. I was trying to prepare for the inevitable. The inevitable? You aging? I am aging, I said calmly. So are you. He gave a humorless smile. I thought I could manage it. Manage it. Not walk through it together. Manage it. I will not be managed, I said quietly. He nodded. I see that now. Do you? I wondered. By noon, my attorney arrived. By 3, divorce paperwork had been drafted. Not filed, but prepared. Not out of vengeance, out of protection. Susan's team continued tracing Blue Crescent's transactions. Preliminary findings suggested more aggressive financial structuring than James likely fully understood. Nathan's prior firm was already under quiet review by regulators. Dr. Klein, when confronted with documentation, requested counsel immediately. The collapse was not explosive. It was structural, a slow dismantling of carefully arranged deception. That evening, James packed a suitcase. Not dramatically, not angrily. Methodically. I'll stay at my brother's for a while, he said. I watched him move through the bedroom we had shared for 30 years. Each folded garment felt like a closing chapter. Were you going to tell me? I asked quietly. He paused. I thought you'd thank me one day. For erasing me? For protecting the legacy. Our legacy was built on partnership, I said. Not containment. He zipped the suitcase. At the doorway, he hesitated. I loved you, he said. Did you? His eyes filled. I still do. I didn't respond. Love that bypasses consent is not love. It is strategy. He left just after sunset. The river reflected orange light as his car disappeared down the driveway. I stood alone in the silence that followed. 30 years of shared decisions reduced to a series of legal conversations. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt something quieter. Awake. The collapse had not destroyed me. It had revealed the fault lines I had ignored. And sometimes revelation is the only way forward. A year has a way of rearranging everything. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly. Through paperwork, through empty spaces at the dinner table, through mornings when you wake up and reach across the bed only to find cool sheets. It has been 12 months since the anniversary night. 12 months since lanterns flickered over a celebration that became an exposure. The river is still here. The house is still standing. Hayes Interiors is still operating. But nothing is the same. The independent neurological evaluation came back 3 weeks after James moved out. Comprehensive, unbiased, administered by a specialist with no financial entanglements. The results were clear. No cognitive impairment. No early dementia. Mild stress-related fatigue. Normal aging. When I read the report, I didn't feel victorious. I felt relieved and oddly saddened, because it meant this had never been about my mind. It had been about fear and control. The divorce finalized 8 months after the party. There were no screaming courtroom scenes, no dramatic accusations. Just attorneys, mediators, and signatures. James did not contest the documentation once Susan's findings were formally presented. Blue Crescent Holdings dissolved under regulatory scrutiny. Nathan Graves quietly relocated out of state after his advisory license was suspended pending investigation. Dr. Klein resigned from her hospital board position and settled a malpractice complaint without admitting fault. Consequences, like truth, tend to surface eventually. James and I divided assets fairly. I insisted on that. I refused to let the ending turn vindictive. 30 years deserved at least that much dignity. Sophie and Owen visit often now. At first, their conversations were cautious. They tiptoed around the topic of their father, around the word betrayal, around the concept of aging. But time softens edges. One evening last fall, Owen stood by the river with me as the sun dipped below the water. "You scared me that night," he admitted. "Because of the speech?" "Because I realized how quickly things can shift. I thought you two were unbreakable." "So did I." He nodded. "I'm glad you didn't just explode. You handled it." Handled it. I've thought about that word often. I didn't handle it because I'm strong. I handled it because panic would have completed their narrative. If I had raged, they would have labeled it instability. If I had wept publicly, they would have cited emotional fragility. Calm was my only defense. Sophie asked me recently if I would ever forgive her father. "I don't know," I told her honestly. "Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting." James wrote to me once. A handwritten letter. No legal language, no strategy. He admitted he had been terrified watching his mother decline years ago. He admitted he began interpreting every small mistake I made as confirmation of history repeating itself. "I thought if I moved first, I could control the outcome," he wrote. Control. The word returns like a refrain. He ended the letter with a line that stayed with me. "I forgot that partnership requires conversation, not management." I have not responded. Not because I hate him, not because I want him to suffer, but because I am still understanding what remains. What remains is this. I am not diminished. I am not fragile. I am not something to be quietly transitioned into irrelevance. Aging does not mean surrendering autonomy. Love does not mean forfeiting agency. And fear, no matter how well-intentioned, does not justify deception. There are evenings now when I sit on the dock alone with a glass of wine. The house behind me is quieter. The routines are simpler. I cook smaller meals. I leave lights off in rooms no one uses. But I also breathe differently. More deliberately. There is clarity in knowing you were nearly erased and that you stepped back into your own outline before it happened. I sometimes replay the dressing room moment in my mind. She won't see it coming. I almost didn't. That realization humbles me. Trust is a beautiful thing, but blind trust can become a vulnerability. If there is one lesson I carry forward, it is this. Partnership requires transparency. Silence breeds assumptions. Assumptions breed control. And control left unchecked can masquerade as care. I don't know what James's future looks like. I don't know whether time will reshape our relationship into something gentler. Friendship perhaps, or at least civility. What I know is that the illusion we built could not survive secrecy. And sometimes losing an illusion saves your life. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt quietly sidelined, quietly managed, quietly dismissed, I want you to pause. Ask questions. Seek clarity. Calm is not weakness. Documentation is not paranoia. And advocating for yourself is not selfish. I would never have chosen to end 30 years this way. But I would choose every time to remain present in my own life. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever faced a moment where trust cracked and you had to decide who you really were, I want to know. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you would have done. Tell me whether you believe fear can justify control. We share stories like this every day, not to create division, but to create awareness. So if you want to continue this journey with me, subscribe. Stay with us. There are more conversations ahead, more truths to uncover, more quiet awakenings to explore. Because none of us should fade quietly into someone else's plan. Not at 30, not at 60, not ever.